I thought I had prepared myself for everything that morning, but I wasn't prepared for the way the judge froze the moment he looked at me. It was subtle at first, just a pause that stretched a second too long, his hand hovering above the papers on his desk, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to place a face from a distant memory. Then came the silence, heavy and unmistakable, spreading across the courtroom like a ripple. My daughter-in-law shifted beside my son, her confidence flickering for the briefest moment before she straightened her shoulders again, convinced, as always, that she was in control. Ethan didn't notice. He was staring down at his hands, avoiding me the way he had for months now, as if eye contact might force him to remember who I used to be to him. I stood there quietly, my purse held in both hands, my posture steady, my expression calm. I had learned long ago that the most powerful moments are often the quietest ones. "Ma'am, have we met before?" the judge asked finally, his voice lower than it had been just seconds earlier. A simple question, but it landed in that room like something far more significant. Sophia let out a soft, dismissive laugh under her breath, the kind she used whenever she wanted to make someone feel small without saying a word. To her, I was still just the inconvenient old woman she had spent the last 2 years trying to push out of her life. The burden, the obstacle, the one standing between her and everything she believed she deserved. 48 hours earlier, she had stood in my kitchen, leaning casually against the marble counter she had insisted on renovating, and told me, "It's time you move on, Margaret. This house is too much for you." It always was. I remember the way the afternoon light hit her perfectly styled hair, the way she smiled as if she were offering me a kindness instead of an ultimatum. Ethan had stood beside her, silent, his agreement spoken through his absence of protest. That was the moment I understood something had shifted in my family, something deeper than simple distance. But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded, just as I was doing now in this courtroom, as the judge continued to study my face like he had just uncovered a piece of a puzzle he wasn't expecting to find. Because what no one in that room knew, not Sophia, not even my own son, was that the woman they had spent months underestimating had never truly been powerless. And in that silence, as the judge's expression slowly changed from confusion to recognition, I realized the moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. I did not answer the judge right away. Instead, I met his gaze with the same calm I had practiced for years, the kind that comes from knowing more than you say. Around me, I could feel the shift beginning, subtle but undeniable, like the air before a storm. Sophia noticed it too. I saw it in the way her fingers tightened around her handbag, the way her smile did not quite reach her eyes anymore. She leaned slightly toward Ethan and whispered something under her breath, but he only gave a distracted nod, still unwilling to look in my direction. That had become his habit lately, avoidance dressed up as indifference. 2 years earlier, after he married Sophia, the distance had started as small things. Shorter phone calls, missed Sunday dinners, excuses that sounded reasonable until they became a pattern. I told myself it was normal, that every mother has to step back eventually. But stepping back is not the same as being pushed out, and I had felt the difference long before I was willing to admit it. The house I had lived in for over 30 years began to feel unfamiliar, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was no longer part of the decisions being made inside it. Furniture replaced without asking me. Locks changed without explanation. Even the mail stopped arriving in my name. It was quiet, calculated, almost polite on the surface, but underneath it carried a message I could not ignore. "You do not belong here anymore." Still, I said nothing. I watched. I listened. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. That I was tired. That I was confused. That I did not understand the documents they placed in front of me or the conversations they had just out of earshot. Sophia was careful, I will give her that. She never raised her voice, never showed impatience in front of others. But control does not always come from loudness. Sometimes it is in the small corrections, the subtle redirections, the way she answered questions meant for Ethan before he even had a chance to speak. And he let her. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not what she did, but what he allowed. In the courtroom, the judge leaned forward slightly now, his expression sharpening as recognition continued to settle across his features. "Margaret Collins," he said slowly, as if testing the name against something in his memory. My name, spoken not with dismissal, but with weight. And for the first time since this process began, I saw uncertainty pass between my son and his wife, a silent question neither of them could answer. I kept my hands still, my voice steady when I finally spoke. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "Nothing more. Because sometimes the truth does not need to be explained. It only needs the right moment to be seen." I saw the exact moment the balance shifted, not in the judge, but in Sophia. It was small, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying attention, but I had spent years learning how to read what people try to hide. Her posture changed, just slightly, her shoulders no longer relaxed but held with intention, as if she were bracing for something she could not yet name. Ethan finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was something unfamiliar in his expression. Not warmth, not recognition, but uncertainty. That alone told me everything I needed to know. For months, they had been certain. Certain that I was out of options. Certain that I would sign whatever they placed in front of me. Certain that this courtroom was simply the final step in a process they had already won. But certainty is fragile when it is built on assumptions. The judge cleared his throat, glancing down at the file before him, then back at me, his eyes sharper now, more focused. "I was not expecting to see your name on this case," he said, his voice measured, careful. Sophia let out a soft breath beside Ethan, a quiet attempt to regain control. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, stepping forward just enough to insert herself back into the center of attention. "This is a straightforward matter. My husband and I are simply trying to ensure that Mrs. Collins is properly cared for. The property in question has become difficult for her to manage." Her tone was practiced, warm on the surface, but I could hear the steel underneath it. She had rehearsed this. She had likely repeated these exact words more than once, confident they would carry the weight she needed them to. The judge did not respond immediately. Instead, he continued to look at me, as if weighing something beyond the documents in front of him. That hesitation unsettled her more than any question could have. I remembered another moment, not long ago, when she had used that same tone with me, standing in my living room, holding a folder filled with neatly organized papers. "It is just a formality," she had said, placing a pen gently on the table in front of me. "This will make everything easier for everyone." Easier. That word had been repeated so often it had almost lost its meaning. Easier for them to make decisions without me. Easier for them to move forward without looking back. I had picked up the pen that day, feeling its weight in my hand, aware of the expectation hanging in the air. And then I had set it back down, just as calmly. Not refusing, not agreeing, just waiting. Back in the courtroom, the judge finally spoke again, but this time his attention was no longer divided. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "before we proceed, I would like to clarify something regarding your legal standing in this matter." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that neither Sophia nor Ethan had anticipated. I could feel it in the way the room seemed to still, in the way even the smallest movements paused, as if everyone sensed that whatever came next would not follow the script they had written. I drew in a quiet breath, steady and unhurried, and lifted my chin just slightly, because the moment they believed they controlled had just begun to slip through their hands. The judge's words did not rush forward, and neither did I. That was always the difference between those who understood power and those who only believed they held it. Sophia shifted again, this time more noticeably, her confidence beginning to fracture at the edges. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still controlled but no longer effortless, "I am not sure what clarification is necessary. The documentation clearly shows that my husband is the rightful decision-maker regarding his mother's living arrangements and the associated property." She gestured lightly toward the stack of papers, as if their existence alone should settle the matter. The judge did not look at them. That was the first real break in her control. Instead, he kept his attention on me, his expression no longer uncertain, but measured in a way that suggested he was assembling something piece by piece. "Documentation can be presented in many ways," he replied calmly, "but legal standing is determined by facts that cannot be adjusted." There was a subtle shift in the room again, the kind that is not loud but deeply felt. Ethan finally spoke, his voice hesitant, as if he were stepping into unfamiliar ground. "Your Honor, we are only trying to help my mother. She has had difficulty keeping up with the house, and we believe it is in her best interest to transfer control." His words sounded rehearsed, but not with the same confidence as Sophia's. There was something underneath them now, a question he was not ready to ask. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him, and for a moment, our eyes met. In that brief connection, I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the one who would sit at the kitchen table with his homework spread out, asking me questions he believed I always had the answers to. That memory passed quickly, replaced again by the man standing beside his wife, unsure of the ground beneath him. I did not speak to him. Not yet. Instead, I looked back at the judge. "You may proceed, Your Honor," I said, my voice even, offering nothing more than permission, because that was what this moment required. Not defense, not explanation, just patience. The judge nodded slightly, then reached for a document within the file, one that had not yet been mentioned. "Before any transfer of control can be considered," he said, "we must first establish who currently holds legal authority over the estate in question." Sophia's breath caught, just for a second, but it was enough. "That has already been established," she replied quickly, stepping forward again, her tone sharpening despite her effort to keep it composed. "My husband is the sole heir." The word heir lingered in the air, heavy with assumption. The judge finally glanced down at the document in his hand, then back up at me, and there was no hesitation left in his expression now. "That is not what this document indicates," he said. And in that quiet statement, everything they believed to be certain began to come undone. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence that followed the judge's words was not confusion, but something heavier, something that pressed down on the room with quiet authority. Sophia blinked, once, then again, as if trying to force reality back into the shape she expected. "That must be a mistake," she said, her voice quick, almost too quick, the smooth control she had maintained now edged with urgency. "We have reviewed every document. Everything clearly states that my husband inherited the estate." The judge did not react to her insistence. He simply lifted the paper slightly, his eyes moving across the lines with deliberate precision before speaking again. "This is an updated trust agreement," he said, his tone steady, unmistakably final. "Filed and notarized 6 years ago. It names Margaret Collins as the primary beneficiary and sole authority over all associated assets." The words settled into the room one by one, each carrying more weight than the last. I did not move. I did not need to. Ethan turned towards Sophia, his confusion no longer hidden, his voice low but strained. "What is he talking about?" he asked. It was not an accusation, not yet, but it was the first crack. Sophia shook her head immediately, a reflex more than a response. "I do not know," she said, though the tightness in her voice suggested otherwise. "This was never mentioned. We handled everything after your father passed. There was nothing about a trust like this." I watched them both, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with the quiet clarity that comes when the truth finally steps into the light. 6 years ago, I had sat in a different office, across from a man who spoke carefully, who asked questions most people do not think to ask until it is too late. I had listened, I had considered, and I had made a decision that no one else knew about. Not Ethan, not Sophia, not even the friends who believed they understood my life completely. It was not a decision made out of fear. It was made out of awareness. Back then, I had already begun to notice the small shifts, the subtle changes in tone, the way respect can quietly turn into expectation. I had seen enough to know that love, when tied too closely to inheritance, can become something else entirely. In the courtroom, the judge placed the document down with measured care. "Mrs. Collins has maintained full legal authority over the estate," he continued. "Any attempt to transfer control without her consent would be considered invalid." This time, the silence that followed was different. It was not just heavy. It was revealing. Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly, as if the certainty he had been standing on had suddenly disappeared beneath him. Sophia did not speak again right away. She stood still, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes no longer steady. I finally took a small step forward, not to confront, not to claim victory, but simply to stand where I had always belonged. Because the truth does not need to be raised. It only needs to be acknowledged. And now, there was no one left in that room who could pretend they did not see it. No one argued with the judge after that. Not immediately. Because some truths do not invite debate. They simply dismantle everything that came before them. I could see it settling in Ethan first, not as acceptance, but as a slow unraveling. His mind was moving, trying to reconcile what he had believed with what he had just heard, and the two no longer fit together. He looked at me again, this time without avoidance, without distance, but with something closer to disbelief. "Mom, is that true?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty he had carried into this room. I did not rush to answer him. I let the question exist for a moment, just as I had let so many things exist without interruption over the past few years. Then I gave him the only answer that mattered. "Yes," I said simply. No explanation, no justification, just the truth, placed between us without decoration. Sophia stepped forward again, but this time there was no elegance in the movement, no careful control. It was reactive, urgent. "There is no way this was hidden for 6 years," she said, her tone sharper now, the polished calm finally cracking. "We handled all of the estate paperwork. Every account, every asset. This would have come up." The judge's gaze shifted to her briefly, not with hostility, but with a quiet firmness that made it clear he had already reached his conclusions. "It did not come up because it was not meant to be accessed without Mrs. Collins' authorization," he replied. "The trust was structured to remain independent of standard probate proceedings." That explanation, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything else said in the room. I could see Sophia process it, not fully understanding every legal detail, but grasping enough to recognize what it meant. Control had never been within her reach. It had only appeared that way. I remembered the afternoon she first brought those documents to me, the ones she had described as necessary, as routine. The way she had guided the conversation, filling in pauses before I could speak, framing each decision as something already agreed upon. I had listened then, just as I was listening now, aware of the intention beneath the words. But I had also known something she did not. That everything she was building her certainty on existed only at the surface. In the courtroom, Ethan took a step back, the movement small but telling, as if he needed distance from something he could no longer stand firmly beside. He looked at Sophia, then at me, caught between two versions of reality that could not both be true. I did not move toward him. I did not reach out. Some distances cannot be closed with a single step. The judge adjusted the papers in front of him, his voice steady as he continued. "Mrs. Collins, would you like to address the court regarding how you wish to proceed?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question directly. Not what I should do, not what would be easier, but what I wanted. I let the silence return once more, not as hesitation, but as intention. Because this moment was not about proving anything. It was about deciding what came next. I did not answer the judge right away, even though every eye in that courtroom had shifted toward me. The silence stretched again, but this time it belonged to me. For years, decisions had been made around me, spoken over me, simplified for me as if I were no longer capable of understanding the life I had built. And now, for the first time in a long time, the question had come directly to me. "What do you want?" I let my gaze move briefly to Ethan, not to confront him, but to acknowledge the distance that had grown between us. He looked different standing there, not because anything about him had changed physically, but because the certainty he once wore so easily was gone. In its place was something far more fragile. Doubt. He opened his mouth slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. Sophia, however, recovered faster. She always did. "Your Honor," she said, her tone carefully measured again, though the strain was still there beneath it. "My husband and I are only trying to make sure that Mrs. Collins is taken care of properly. This is not about control, it is about responsibility." Responsibility. The word lingered in the air, polished and respectable, designed to sound like concern. I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition. I had heard that word used in many different ways over the years, and I had learned that it often meant something very different depending on who was speaking it. I turned back to the judge, my posture unchanged, my voice calm when I finally spoke. "I have taken care of myself for a long time, Your Honor," I said, "and I intend to continue doing so." It was not a dramatic statement. It did not need to be. The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else I could have added. The judge nodded slightly, as if that answer aligned with something he had already understood. "Then to be clear," he continued, "you are not consenting to any transfer of property or authority at this time." I held his gaze, steady and certain. "No," I said. "One word. Enough." Beside me, I heard the quiet shift of movement as Sophia adjusted her stance again, this time less controlled, more restless. Ethan exhaled slowly, a sound that seemed to carry more than just breath, but the weight of realization settling in. I did not look at them again, not because I was avoiding them, but because I no longer needed to measure myself against their expectations. The judge made a brief note, his pen moving across the page with deliberate clarity. "Very well," he said. "Then this court will proceed based on the established authority of Mrs. Collins." That was it. No raised voices. No dramatic declarations. Just a quiet correction of reality. And in that correction, everything they had been building toward began to lose its shape. I stood there, still and composed, not as someone reclaiming something lost, but as someone who had never truly given it away. Because power does not always need to be taken back. Sometimes, it was never taken in the first place. The shift did not end with the judge's ruling. It lingered, stretching into every corner of the courtroom, settling into the spaces between words, between glances, between breaths. I could feel it most clearly in the way Sophia stopped speaking. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood, finally, that saying more would not restore what had already been undone. Her silence was different now. It was no longer strategic. It was forced. Ethan remained where he stood, but something about him had changed in a way that could not be reversed. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way a person does when they realize they have misunderstood something important for far too long. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked quietly, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to reach for something that was already out of his grasp. I turned my head slightly toward him, considering the question not for its words, but for what it revealed. "You did not ask," I said. My voice was not harsh. It did not need to be. The truth, when spoken plainly, carries its own weight. He lowered his gaze again, absorbing that answer in a way that no explanation could soften. The judge closed the file in front of him with a soft, deliberate motion, signaling the end of what had been presented. "Given the clarification of authority," he said, "this matter does not proceed as originally filed. Any further action would require a different legal basis." His words were formal, measured, but their meaning was simple. The path they had chosen no longer existed. Sophia inhaled slowly, her composure returning in fragments, but it was not the same composure she had entered with. It was thinner, more cautious. "Then we will need time to review this new information," she said, carefully reclaiming her tone, though the confidence behind it had shifted into something more restrained. The judge nodded once. "You may consult with your counsel," he replied. "But as it stands, Mrs. Collins retains full control." Full control. The phrase echoed quietly, not because it was new, but because it had finally been acknowledged in a place where it could not be ignored. I adjusted my grip on my purse, a small, steady movement that grounded me in the moment. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued. I had not needed to. Everything that needed to be said had already been revealed through patience and timing. As the room began to move again, papers gathering, chairs shifting, quiet conversations starting at the edges, I remained where I was for a moment longer. Not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Because this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of seeing things clearly. And clarity, once it arrives, does not leave quietly. The courtroom did not empty all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a scene that had lost its original script and was now searching for a new one. Lawyers gathered their papers with quieter movements than before, voices lowered, as if something unspoken had shifted the tone of the entire room. I remained where I stood for a moment longer, watching without appearing to watch, listening without needing to hear every word. That was something I had learned over time. You do not always need to be part of a conversation to understand it. Ethan approached me first, though not with the confidence he once had. His steps were slower, uncertain, as if each one required more thought than it should have. "Mom," he said, stopping a few feet away, not close enough to reach me, but not distant enough to pretend he was unaffected. The words sounded different now, heavier, as if he had only just remembered its meaning. I turned to face him fully, my expression unchanged, my posture steady. "I did not know," he continued, his voice low, almost careful, "about any of this." I studied him for a brief moment, not to judge, not to measure, but simply to see him clearly. "No," I said, "you did not. It was not an accusation. It was a fact. Sophia joined him a second later, her presence no longer leading, but following, her earlier certainty replaced by something more controlled, more calculated. "Margaret," she said, choosing my name carefully, as if formality might restore some balance. "There has clearly been a misunderstanding." I almost smiled again, not because the situation was amusing, but because the word felt familiar. Misunderstanding. It was a softer way to describe something that had been far more deliberate. "I do not believe there has been," I replied calmly. She held my gaze for a moment, searching for something she could use, some opening, some hesitation, but there was none to find. For the first time since I had known her, she did not have the advantage of assumption. Ethan shifted beside her, his discomfort visible now in ways he could not hide. "We were trying to help," he said again, though the words carried less certainty than before. "I know what you believed," I said. I did not say more. I did not need to. Because belief, once separated from truth, tends to reveal itself without explanation. There was a pause then, longer this time, not filled with tension, but with realization. Around us, the courtroom continued to empty, the noise of movement fading into the background, leaving only the quiet space between us. Sophia glanced toward the exit, then back at me, as if weighing her next step. "We should discuss this privately," she said, her tone returning to something more composed, though still careful. I shook my head slightly, not in refusal, but in clarity. "There is nothing left to discuss today," I said. My voice remained steady, unchanged, but the meaning was clear. This moment was not about negotiation. It was about recognition. And recognition, once it happens, cannot be undone. The space between us did not close after my words. If anything, it became more defined, as if a line had been drawn that neither of them quite knew how to cross anymore. Ethan looked like he wanted to say something else, something that might repair what had shifted, but he did not know where to begin. That was the nature of certain realizations. They do not arrive with instructions. Sophia, on the other hand, recovered in a different way, not by retreating, but by adjusting. I could see it in the way her posture straightened again, her expression smoothing just enough to suggest control, even if it was no longer complete. "Margaret," she said, her tone quieter now, more measured. "This does not have to become something bigger than it is. We can still handle everything as a family." The word family lingered between us, softer than before, but no less intentional. I held her gaze for a moment, not rejecting the word, but not accepting it in the way she meant it either. "Family does not require control," I said calmly. The sentence was simple, but it settled into the silence with a weight that neither of them could ignore. Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, as if each breath required more effort than the last. "We were worried about you," he added, though his voice lacked the certainty of earlier. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without confirming it. "Worry does not replace trust," I replied. There was no accusation in my tone, only clarity. Around us, the last few people filtered out of the courtroom, leaving the space quieter, more contained. The judge had already stepped away, his role complete, leaving behind a room that no longer belonged to legal arguments, but to something far more personal. Sophia's eyes shifted briefly, calculating, searching for a different angle, a different approach. "Then what do you want, Margaret?" she asked finally. The question was direct, but it carried something new beneath it. Not authority, not assumption, something closer to uncertainty. I considered her question, not because I did not know the answer, but because it deserved to be spoken with intention. "I want what has always been mine," I said. "Nothing more, nothing less." The simplicity of it left no room for interpretation. Ethan looked at me again, this time without hesitation, but with a quiet understanding beginning to form. Not complete, not comfortable, but present. He nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he could no longer argue against. Sophia did not respond right away. She held my gaze for a second longer, then looked away, the first clear sign that she had run out of ways to reshape the moment. I adjusted my purse again, a small, steady motion, then turned slightly toward the exit. Not to escape, not to avoid, but because there was nothing left in this room that required my presence. Some conversations do not end with agreement. They end with clarity. And clarity, once spoken, does not ask for permission to exist. I did not look back immediately as I walked toward the exit. Not because I was avoiding them, but because I no longer needed to measure my steps against theirs. The sound of my heels against the polished floor echoed softly in the nearly empty courtroom, steady and unhurried. Each step marking a quiet conclusion to something that had been building for far longer than either of them realized. I reached the doorway before I heard Ethan's voice again, this time sharper, more urgent. "Mom, wait." I stopped, not out of obligation, but out of choice, and turned just enough to face him without fully stepping back into the room. He had moved closer now, leaving Sophia a few steps behind, and there was something different in the way he stood. Less certain, more exposed. "I should have asked," he said, his words coming slower, as if he were choosing them more carefully than he ever had before. "I should have listened." I studied him for a moment, not searching for the right response, but recognizing the shift in him that could not be undone. "Yes," I said quietly, not to punish him, not to emphasize the mistake, just to acknowledge the truth he had already reached on his own. Sophia approached then, her pace controlled again, though the confidence behind it had changed. She stopped beside him, but she did not speak right away. For once, she allowed the silence to exist without trying to reshape it. When she finally did speak, her tone was different. Not softer in a way that asked for sympathy, but more measured, more aware. "We made decisions without fully understanding the situation," she said. It was not an apology, but it was closer to honesty than anything she had offered before. I held her gaze, seeing not just what she was saying, but what she was choosing not to say. "You made decisions based on what you believed would benefit you," I replied. My voice remained calm, steady, unchanged. The distinction mattered. Ethan looked between us, the space he stood in now far more complicated than the one he had entered with. "What happens now?" he asked, and there was no assumption left in the question. Only uncertainty. I considered that for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because it was no longer something that needed to be explained in detail. "Now," I said, "we live with the truth." The words settled quietly, but they carried more weight than anything else I could have added. Because the truth does not resolve everything. It does not repair what has already been broken, but it does remove the illusion that allowed those things to happen in the first place. I turned then, fully this time, and stepped through the doorway into the hallway beyond. The light outside the courtroom felt different, brighter in a way that had nothing to do with the building itself. Behind me, I could hear nothing but the faint echo of footsteps that did not follow. And for the first time in a long time, that silence felt exactly right. I stepped out of the courthouse and into the open air, letting the door close quietly behind me without looking back again. The city moved the way it always had, cars passing, people walking with purpose, conversations blending into a steady rhythm that did not pause for anyone's personal revelations. For a moment, I stood there on the steps, feeling the cool breeze against my face, the kind that reminds you that the world continues, whether you are ready for it or not. I adjusted my coat, a simple, familiar motion, and began walking down the steps at the same unhurried pace I had carried through the courtroom. There was no rush now. There had not been a rush before. That had always been the difference. I reached the sidewalk and paused just long enough to take in the quiet clarity that had settled inside me. Not relief, not triumph. Something steadier than that. Understanding. For years, I had believed that patience meant waiting for things to change, waiting for people to see what was right in front of them. But patience, I realized, is not about waiting for others. It is about knowing when to step back and let the truth reveal itself without interference. I thought about Ethan then, not as he had stood in that courtroom, uncertain and searching, but as he had once been, a boy who trusted that I would always guide him in the right direction. That part of him was not gone. It was simply buried beneath choices he had not fully understood. Whether he would find his way back to it was no longer something I could decide for him. And for the first time, I accepted that without resistance. Sophia crossed my mind next, not with anger, but with a kind of distant clarity. She had built her confidence on what she believed she could control, on what she assumed no one would challenge. But control based on assumption does not last. It never does. I reached the end of the block and stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change. Around me, people stood in quiet anticipation, each focused on their own destination, their own next step. When the signal shifted, I moved forward with them, not ahead, not behind, just part of the flow again. That was all I had ever needed to be. Not above anyone. Not beneath anyone. Just steady in my own place. As I crossed the street, I realized something that had taken me far too long to fully understand. I had not lost my place in my family. I had simply seen it clearly for what it was. And clarity, once it arrives, does not take anything away. It gives you the freedom to choose what you carry forward and what you leave behind. I did not need to explain myself. I did not need to prove anything further. The truth had already done that for me. And as I continued walking, my steps calm and certain, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by fear or expectation, but by something far simpler. By the quiet certainty of knowing exactly who I am.